Behind the polished image of Duke Ellington, the man who defined big band jazz and shaped music for over 50 years, lies a private story few have ever seen. His Harlem apartment at 935 St. Nicholas Avenue wasn't just a home. It witnessed love affairs, betrayals, and the scars, both literal and emotional, that followed him through life. This was the same Duke Ellington whose wife once slashed his face in jealousy, whose offstage nickname was far less flattering than the Duke, and whose relentless drive to compose thousands of scores kept him above the rest. Yet for all his brilliance, his final years carried a heavy sadness, and his 1974 funeral drew 12,000 mourners, including Ella Fitzgerald, who simply said, "A genius has passed." So what really happened behind the doors of his home? And what secrets of love, legacy, and loss still linger there? Keep watching to find. Duke Ellington was born on April 29, 1899, in Washington, D.C., the only child of James Edward and Daisy Kennedy Ellington. Both of his parents played piano. His mother favored parlor songs, while his father leaned toward operatic arias. They lived with Daisy's parents in the West End neighborhood, where music and dignity filled the household. Daisy herself was the daughter of 2 former slaves, while James worked for the U.S. Navy drafting blueprints. The Ellington home, like many black families in D.C. at the time, was steeped in racial pride. They worked hard to shield young Edward Kennedy Ellington from the harsh realities of Jim Crow America. Daisy, in particular, surrounded her son with refined women to teach him grace and manners. His friends noticed his polished bearing and sharp dress and nicknamed him Duke. Ellington later credited his friend Edgar McEntee, who insisted that if they were to spend time together, young Edward needed a proper title. Though Ellington began piano lessons at 7 with Marietta Clinkscales, he was far more interested in baseball. He later recalled moments when President Theodore Roosevelt himself would ride up on horseback to watch the neighborhood boys play. He attended Armstrong Technical High School, worked selling peanuts at Washington Senators games, and lived the life of a typical D.C. kid. But everything changed when, at 14, Ellington began sneaking into Frank Holliday's pool room. There, the sounds of local pianists lit a spark in him. Soon, he was imitating ragtime players like Doc Perry, Lester Dishman, Lewis Brown, Turner Layton, and U.B. Blake. He absorbed everything, even learning from those who, lacking sheet music, would flip their pages upside down to create new variations. In 1914, while working as a soda jerk, Ellington wrote his first composition, Soda Fountain Rag. He couldn't yet read music, so he played it entirely by ear. To entertain his audiences, he would perform it in multiple styles, as a waltz, tango, one-step, or foxtrot. Listeners never realized it was the same tune, and Ellington suddenly found himself with a repertoire of his own making. With guidance from mentors like his teacher Henry Lee Grant and pianist bandleader Oliver Doc Perry, Ellington learned harmony, reading sheet music, and the basics of professionalism. Encounters with stride piano masters. James P. Johnson and Lucky Roberts expanded his ambitions, and later advice from Fats Waller, Sidney Bechet, and Will Marion Cook deepened his artistry. By his late teens, Ellington was performing in cafes and clubs around D.C., slowly building his reputation. He had once dreamed of becoming a painter and even earned an art scholarship to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. But by 1916, music had claimed him completely. He turned the scholarship down, left school before graduating, and threw himself into a path that would redefine American music. By 1917, Duke Ellington was making a living as a freelance sign painter, but music was never far from his mind. Whenever a client asked for a sign for a dance or party, Ellington would casually ask if they already had entertainment. If they didn't, he'd offer his own services as a pianist. In this way, he built his reputation as both an artist and an entrepreneur. At the same time, he held a messenger job with the U.S. Navy and the State Department, where he made valuable contacts that would later help his music career. In 1919, a chance meeting with drummer Sonny Greer from New Jersey changed the course of his life. Greer encouraged Ellington to take music seriously, fueling his ambition to become a professional. Soon, Ellington moved out of his parents' home, bought his own place, and began performing across Washington, D.C. and Virginia. That same year, he formed his first group, the Duke's Serenaders, though in the phone book he advertised them as the Colored Syncopators. Ellington acted not only as the pianist, but also as the booking agent, hustling gigs wherever he could. Their very first show at True Reformers Hall earned him just 75 cents, but it was a start. The band included some of his closest friends, Otto Hardwick, Arthur Wetzel, Elmer Snowden, and Sonny Greer. Together, they played for embassy parties, private society balls, and even white audiences, a rare feat in the deeply segregated 1920s. When Greer was invited to join Wilbur Sweatman's orchestra in New York, Ellington decided to follow. He left behind a comfortable career in Washington and dove headfirst into Harlem, where the Renaissance was in full swing. Jazz was exploding. The Charleston was the new dance craze, and black musical theater was flourishing with shows like Shuffle Along. But breaking into the New York scene was tough. The young band hustled pool by day, played rent parties at night, and struggled to make ends meet. They found a mentor in stride pianist Willie the Lion Smith, who gave them introductions, and sometimes cash to keep them going. Still, discouraged, they eventually returned to Washington. Their fortunes changed in 1923. A gig in Atlantic City and another at Harlem's exclusive club brought them new attention. By September of that year, they secured a 4-year engagement at the Hollywood Club on Broadway. The band, then known as Elmer Snowden and his Black Sox Orchestra, began to grow in both size and reputation. Among their members was trumpeter James "Bubber" Miley, whose growling, muted style would help define Ellington's early sound. When Snowden left in 1924, Ellington stepped up as leader, renaming the group the Washingtonians. The Hollywood Club later reopened as the Kentucky Club, and it became their home base. Ellington began recording, releasing 8 records in 1924 and receiving his first composing credits, including on Choo Choo. By 1925, his orchestra had expanded to 10 players, developing a distinctive sound marked by Harlem street rhythms, wah-wah trombones, squealing trumpets, and bluesy saxophone lines. For a short time, even the legendary Sidney Bechet joined the band. His fiery New Orleans style clashed with Miley and trombonist Charlie Irvis, but his presence pushed the group to play with even more intensity until his unreliability forced a parting of ways. Ellington, however, was on his way. His small dance band had evolved into something bigger, a jazz orchestra with its own unmistakable identity, poised to reshape American music. By the mid-1920s, Duke Ellington was ready to step onto a larger stage. In October 1926, he struck a pivotal deal with agent and publisher Irving Mills. Mills was known for spotting fresh talent. He had already helped launch names like Hoagy Carmichael, Dorothy Fields, and Harold Arlen. The contract gave Mills a hefty 45% share of Ellington's future earnings, but it also opened doors that Ellington could never have unlocked alone. With Mills guiding him, Ellington began recording at a remarkable pace. Between 1924 and 1926, he had only managed a handful of acoustic sides, but now his music was being pressed across nearly every major label of the era: Brunswick, Victor, Columbia, OK, Pathé, and a host of smaller dime store brands like Cameo, Lincoln, and Banner. Each label marketed his band under different names: the Harlem Footwarmers, the Jungle Band, the Whoopie Makers, the 10 Blackberries, helping him reach a wide audience while building his reputation. Mills, for his part, often claimed co-composer credit, but his relentless promotion gave Ellington national visibility. Then, in 1927, came the turning point. King Oliver had just turned down an offer to serve as the house band at Harlem's famous Cotton Club. Jimmy McHugh, a songwriter and producer, suggested Ellington for the slot, and Mills quickly arranged an audition. To meet the club's standards, Ellington expanded his band from 6 musicians to 11, and on December 4, 1927, they officially began their residency. The Cotton Club was no ordinary venue. It catered to a wealthy, exclusively white clientele, offering elaborate revues that blended comedy sketches, dance numbers, burlesque, and plenty of bootleg liquor. Ellington and his orchestra provided the soundtrack to it all, performing nightly while also appearing on weekly radio broadcasts that carried their music far beyond Harlem. During this period, Ellington worked with some of the top songwriters of the day. Jimmy McHugh and Dorothy Fields provided many of the club's musical numbers, later joined by Harold Arlen and Ted Koehler. Ellington mixed in his own compositions as well, shaping the band's unique sound. Around this time, he also entered into a relationship with dancer Mildred Dixon, who became his second wife. The Cotton Club years marked Ellington's breakthrough. The combination of live shows, radio exposure, and constant recordings made him a household name. His band was no longer just another Harlem outfit. They were on their way to becoming one of the defining orchestras of the jazz age. Trumpeter Bubber Miley may have spent only a short time with Duke Ellington's orchestra, but his impact was enormous. Miley was an early master of the growl trumpet, a gritty, expressive style that transformed the band's polished dance hall sound into something far more raw and exciting. Audiences and critics alike began calling it the jungle style, a sound captured perfectly in Miley's chorus on East St. Louis Toodaloo, 1926. In October 1927, Ellington's band recorded with singer Adelaide Hall, and one track in particular, Creole Love Call, became a worldwide sensation. It was the first big hit for both Ellington and Hall, and much of its composition came from Miley himself. He also co-wrote Black and Tan Fantasy, another signature early work. But despite his brilliance, Miley's heavy drinking forced him to leave the band just as Ellington was on the brink of national fame. He died tragically young in 1932, at only 29. His influence, however, lived on through trumpeter Cootie Williams, who stepped into his role. By 1929, Ellington and the Cotton Club Orchestra were expanding beyond Harlem. That year, they spent several months performing in Florence Ziegfeld's Showgirl, alongside vaudeville stars like Jimmy Durante, Eddie Foy Jr., and Ruby Keeler, with music by George Gershwin and Gus Kahn. It was during this run that Ellington came under the mentorship of Ziegfeld's musical supervisor, Will Vaudreuil. Vaudreuil taught him crucial lessons in orchestration, particularly in using chromatic tones outside the traditional scale to deepen and broaden his harmonic palette. Later, biographers noted that while Ellington was often compared to European composers like Debussy and Ravel, his real turning point came from Vaudreuil's guidance. Ellington was also beginning to make his mark in film. In 1929, he starred in Black and Tan, a 19-minute RKO short with an all-African-American cast, in which he played the lead role of Duke. A year later, his orchestra appeared in the Amos and Andy film Check and Double Check, performing a lively ballroom version of Old Man Blues. Around the same time, Ellington shared the stage with French star Maurice Chevalier and brought his orchestra to New York's Roseland Ballroom, one of the country's most prestigious venues. Ellington's reputation was growing beyond jazz circles. The Australian-born composer Percy Grainger even declared, "The 3 greatest composers who ever lived are Bach, Delius, and Duke Ellington. Unfortunately, Bach is dead, Delius is very ill, but we are happy to have with us today the Duke." By 1931, Ellington's first residency at the Cotton Club came to an end, but his sound, shaped by experimentation, mentorship, and bold collaborations, had already begun to change the course of American music. Things you might not know about Duke Ellington. He wasn't the first Ellington in the White House. When President Richard Nixon hosted a historic birthday reception and jam session for Duke Ellington's 70th birthday in 1969, the jazz legend wasn't the first in his family to set foot in the White House. Decades earlier, his father, James Edward Ellington, had worked there part-time as a butler during the Warren G. Harding administration in the early 1920s. In addition to his White House duties, James worked as a driver, handyman, caretaker, and butler for a prominent Washington, D.C. doctor. Had he lived to see 1969, he could have given his son a personal tour of the president's residence. He had another, less flattering nickname. The world knew him as Duke, a name earned early in life thanks to his style, polish, and impeccable manners. But among some of his sidemen, he carried another nickname, Dumpy. Ellington was known for his hearty appetite, and trombonist Tricky Sam Nanton once joked, "He's a genius all right, but Jesus how he eats." Though Ellington always presented himself with elegance, he had a knack for eating well and often. At times, he managed his weight with a strict diet of steak, hot water, grapefruit juice, and coffee. And even when he indulged, Ellington was careful to choose clothes that kept him looking slim and sophisticated. He kept his orchestra ahead of the curve. Jazz changed at lightning speed across Ellington's lifetime. Bands that dominated in the 1920s often sounded outdated by the swing era, and nearly all of the swing orchestras of the 1930s faded away once bebop became the mainstream in the 1940s. Ellington, however, was the rare exception. From 1926 through the early 1970s, his orchestra remained among the top ensembles in jazz. Unlike many band leaders, he never chased trends or locked himself into a single style. Instead, he simply created music he believed in, constantly reimagining his classics like Mood Indigo, Take the A Train, and It Don't Mean a Thing if it ain't got that swing. So they always sounded fresh, modern, and relevant, no matter the decade. How Duke Ellington got his nickname. Long before Edward Kennedy Ellington became the legendary Duke Ellington, the composer who defined big band jazz and reshaped American music, he was just another teenager in Washington, D.C. In 1914, he entered Armstrong Technical High School with dreams of becoming a commercial artist. At the time, his reputation was built more on his drawing and painting than on music. He even earned a fine arts scholarship, later recalling in a 1963 interview, "My talent at that time was acknowledged as being art. I was supposedly a good painter. But while art seemed to be his path, music was already tugging at him." He was a capable pianist, had started composing, and even written his first piece, Soda Fountain Rag. Just before high school, he met Edgar McIntyre, a sharp dresser with a flair for style and social circles. McIntyre quickly became both friend and influence, and it was he who gave Ellington the name that would follow him forever. The story goes that when McIntyre saw his tall, confident friend, always dressed neatly in ties, polished shoes, and suits, he decided Ellington needed a title to match. "I think he felt that if I just had to be his constant companion, I should have a title," Ellington later said. "So he called me Duke, and it just went along with me to this day." Not long after, McIntyre dragged him to a senior party at school and introduced him with the new name, the Duke. Put on the spot, Ellington sat down at the piano and played his second composition, a lively tune he jokingly called, "What You Gonna Do When the Bed Breaks Down?" The room erupted, and just like that, the shy freshman became the toast of the older crowd. Ellington would later remember that night fondly, not just for the applause, but for the discovery that playing piano always seemed to draw a pretty girl to stand near the bass keys. Those early parties gave him confidence and an audience, and within just a few years, by the age of 17, he was performing professionally. From those beginnings, the Duke went on to change the course of popular music with classics like Mood Indigo, I Got It Bad, and That Ain't Good, and It Don't Mean a Thing if it ain't got that swing. His wife slashed his face because he was cheating with this actress? Duke Ellington carried a scar across his left cheek that became part of his image, though few knew the story behind it. A quick glance at photographs of him often reveals a preference for showing his right profile, and there was a reason. Ellington had been a notorious womanizer. His wife, Edna Thompson, whom he had married in 1918 when they were both just teenagers, grew tired of it. By the late 1920s, After years of infidelity, her patience ran out. In a fit of anger, she slashed his face with a razor. Edna had been his high school sweetheart, and together they had a son, Mercer, born in 1919. But while family life tied Ellington down, fame pulled him elsewhere. By 1923, he was leading his own band, Duke Ellington and his orchestra, and with success came admirers. According to his bandmates, he often kept women in different cities, sometimes even renting multiple hotel rooms at once so he could decide at the end of the night who would join him. As his reputation soared, so did his temptations. By 1927, Ellington was a star at the Cotton Club in Harlem, one of the most prestigious venues of its time. The groupies only multiplied, and Edna was forced to watch her husband's attention drift further and further from home. The breaking point came around 1928 or 1929. Ellington was working on his sound film debut, Black and Tan, released in December 1929. In the opening scenes of the movie, the scar isn't visible, but by the final sequence, it is unmistakable. This timeline suggests the violent confrontation with Edna happened during filming. Which affair pushed her over the edge remains unclear, but many historians believe it was Ellington's co-star, actress, and dancer Freddie Washington. Stunning and charismatic, Washington was described by Ellington's drummer, Sonny Greer, as having gorgeous skin, perfect features, green eyes, and a figure. When she smiled, that was it. Freddie Washington was light-skinned enough to pass for white, a trait shared by both Duke Ellington's wife, Edna, and his longtime mistress. Many believe this reveals Ellington's type. Washington's most famous film role came in the 1934 version of Imitation of Life, where she played a young black woman attempting, and failing, to pass as white in society. Her casting in such a role underscored her striking beauty and undeniable screen presence. For Edna Ellington, however, Washington may have been the woman who pushed Duke's affairs too far. In real life, Washington could have passed for white, and was often encouraged to do so in order to secure more roles in film and dance. But she refused. She chose instead to embrace her identity, and to embrace a very public affair with a very married Duke Ellington. Ellington never publicly acknowledged their relationship, but Washington herself admitted it years later to film historian Donald Bogle. "I just had to accept that he wasn't going to marry me. But I wasn't going to be his mistress," she explained. Their romance was no secret in entertainment circles, and even Duke's son Mercer later described it in his 1979 memoir as a torrid love affair that was likely one of the most serious relationships of his father's life. The timing raises questions. While Ellington and Washington worked together on the film Black and Tan, Duke's famous scar appeared. It wasn't visible at the start of filming, but by the end it was clear. Did Edna lash out after discovering this particular affair? Many historians think so. Edna certainly knew the damage she inflicted. Yes, it was revenge, but it was also a calculated strike at her husband's vanity. Ellington was notoriously self-conscious about his appearance, and from the moment he was scarred, he avoided showing the left side of his face. In photographs, he almost always angled his right cheek toward the camera. When he met the Queen of England, unaware that a camera was nearby, the scar was visible, a rare moment he hadn't controlled. After the attack, Duke and Edna separated for good, though they never divorced. He continued to support her financially for the rest of his life, but rarely mentioned her again. Many who knew him assumed she had died. As for the scar itself, Ellington enjoyed keeping the truth ambiguous. In his autobiography, Music is My Mistress, he offered 4 different explanations: a taxicab accident, a fall on a broken bottle, a jealous woman, or an old-fashioned saber duel. "Take your pick," he wrote. But those closest to him never doubted which one was true. Irving Mills, his arranger on the Black and Tan set, summed it up simply: women was one of the highlights of his life. He had to have women. He always had a woman, always had somebody. Ellington lived the rest of his life still married to Edna, but free to pursue other romances. Freddie Washington, however, eventually moved on. After her relationship with Duke ended, she married his trombonist, Lawrence Brown, in 1933. The marriage lasted until 1951. Later, she wed Dr. Hugh Anthony Bell, a dentist, and settled in Connecticut, leaving behind both show business and the chaotic love life that had once tied her to the Duke. Duke Ellington never allowed his piano playing to grow stale. In the 1920s, most jazz pianists were stride players, keeping time with their left hand by alternating bass notes and chords, while their right hand carried the melody. Ellington, inspired by giants like Willie the Lion Smith and James P. Johnson, quickly mastered the style. But unlike most of his peers, aside from the equally forward-looking Mary Lou Williams, Ellington kept evolving. He modernized his sound decade after decade, so much so that by the 1940s, he was influencing younger innovators like Thelonious Monk. Even in the early 1970s, when Ellington was in his 70s, his percussive touch, daring use of space, and dissonant harmonies could have passed for the playing of a man half his age. He also pushed the limits of what recordings could capture. Before the LP arrived in the late 1940s, music was confined to 78 RPM discs that held just 3 minutes of sound per side. Occasionally, a 12-inch disc stretched to 5 minutes, but most bands used the space for medleys. Ellington, however, was one of the first to write extended works for records. His 1929 two-part Tiger Rag was little more than a jam, but by 1931's Creole Rhapsody and 1935's four-part Reminiscing in Tempo, he was exploring themes that stretched well beyond the standard 3-minute frame. In the 1940s, his grand suite Black, Brown, and Beige ran nearly an hour, though it had to be cut down to a 12-minute four-part version when released on records. Even at the height of his fame, few fans would have bought 10 separate discs just to hear one suite in full. Beyond music, Ellington carried himself with dignity and used his platform to celebrate Black pride long before it became part of a national movement. He openly used the word black in titles like Black and Tan Fantasy, 1927, Black Beauty, 1928, When a Black Man's Blue, 1930, Black Butterfly, 1936, and of course his towering 1943 suite, Black, Brown, and Beige. And whenever he appeared in films, starting with the 1929 short Black and Tan, he and his orchestra presented themselves as serious artists, not the comic caricatures that Hollywood often assigned to black performers at the time. For all his thousands of compositions, though, Ellington never officially recorded the very first piece he wrote. At just 15 years old in 1914, he composed Soda Fountain Rag. He played it on rare occasions, and a few obscure concert versions survive from 1937, 1957, and 1964. But in all his years in the studio, Ellington never sat down to give his debut piece a proper recording. Duke Ellington passed away on May 24, 1974, at the age of 75, following complications from lung cancer and pneumonia. His funeral was held at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City, where more than 12,000 mourners gathered to pay their respects. Among them was Ella Fitzgerald, who captured the sorrow of the moment with a simple tribute. "It's a very sad day. A genius has passed." Ellington was laid to rest at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, where his legacy continues to live on. At the time of his death in 1974, Duke Ellington's net worth was estimated at around $1 million, a significant sum for a jazz musician of his era, though modest compared to the immense cultural value of his work. Much of his wealth came from decades of composing, touring, and recording, but Ellington was never known for flaunting riches. Instead, his greatest treasure was the place he called home, his apartment in Harlem at 935 St. Nicholas Avenue. Ellington moved into apartment A4 in 1939, when he was already a national figure in jazz. The building itself, constructed in 1915 in the late Gothic Revival style, was as grand and dignified as the music he created within its walls. The ground floor had the appearance of a raised basement, with stone bands running between its windows. The middle floors rose in symmetry, accented by carved decorative panels, while the top floor featured peaked arch windows framed with elaborate stone surrounds. Above it all, a parapet crowned the structure, flanked with turrets and projections that gave the building a castle-like elegance. From the inside, apartment A4 became Ellington's creative sanctuary. It was here that he composed some of his most celebrated works, including Black, Brown, and Beige. The apartment witnessed late-night writing sessions, endless rehearsals, and meetings that shaped the course of American music. Today, the building at 935 St. Nicholas Avenue still stands, preserved as a National Historic Landmark and listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Though Ellington is long gone, his spirit lingers in the stone, the arches, and the very walls that once echoed with his piano. The Harlem residence remains more than a home. It is a monument to one of the greatest composers in American history.